So just while we are waiting, I want to just, Sunil was saying that the exams were in May and the grades have come out now. So I'm going to get my students' papers on Sunday and I'll give them the grades on Monday. So it's a different cycle. Um, I just want to say before we go ahead how extraordinary it is for me to come back to CDS. I came here in 1978, and there are at least a few people in this room who made it possible for me to come. Kannan was the first person I met, according to my recollection, in December of 1977, and he encouraged me to come to CDS. I have to say that from that moment, the notion that somebody completely untutored in economics was welcome at CDS was itself a very welcome and inspiring thought. Obviously, Jose was here at the time. Mrs. Gulati is not here, but Iqbal Gulati was a very important influence in my life. T.N. Krishnan. But my most lasting memory as well as influence is Dr. Raj, who I had the great privilege of doing my MPhil thesis with, spending many hours, not just in his office, but also in his home. And as I was telling students a few minutes ago, Raj taught me two things: intellectual integrity and placing economics in the context of history and politics. There's a tendency for policymakers, especially people like us who work at the World Bank and IMF, to give policy advice. What Raj emphasized and what I relearned when I was writing my own book is how important history is. History is important because it sets the conditions under which we operate. History has what you will see in a minute, what I call critical junctures. There are certain moments in history when things are possible, and there are certain moments when things become less possible. And understanding the principle of critical junctures and the ability to exploit them is very central to the historical process. So Raj left me one last gift, which is an abiding friendship with his son Gopal, who is also visiting us over here. Coming back, just to conclude, has brought back so many memories. It's been a very emotional morning for me. And as I was telling the students, in many ways, I grew up over here. I came as a student, and I matured as somebody who was beginning to find his place in the world of economic policy making. So for that, I'm extraordinarily grateful to various generations of CDS faculty and students, and I look today at the many students and I admire them for the journey they are setting out on. The one thing I would say on the MPhil batch that I was in, Sunil already mentioned it was a very special batch. And the only thing I would add to that is that I would not have got the prize that year. If there was an MPhil prize that year for the best student, I would not have been the recipient. There were at least a few other people who did much better than I did. I did well by my own standards, but there were students who did even much better. So that itself was a very energizing process. It was frustrating sometimes because our debates were often very rough, but in retrospect, I remember them with a lot of gratitude. All right, so much for background. So I'm going to, what I did, since I have primarily worked in the last 25 years on international issues, and in the last 6 years very specially focused on Europe because I was operationally involved, and then I started this intellectual journey into the Euro. I'm using this as an opportunity to ask the question, is India prepared for its future? And in trying to ask that question, I went back to the past. And I start at the outset. I hope you can read the charts there. Gopal, you can read it, right? It's visible, right? Yeah. So there were two problems at the start. One was that the Indian economy was not competitive. There was a devaluation in 1949. A devaluation is a process when your economy is not competitive, you devalue your currency to gain competitiveness. But then in 1959, Raj had a very important paper. And the Raj paper said, really the most central issue that will determine our economic future is jobs. He's the first one who's discussed the issue of underemployment, what he called disguised employment. He highlighted the importance of unemployment amongst the educated. He pointed out, he gave an actually uncanny estimate of the likely population size by the year 2000. The Indian population was 360 million at that time. He said, I expect that population will grow at about 1.8 to 2%, which roughly puts it at about 1 billion people by the end of the century. And he said that India's economic, social, and political future will depend on whether we are able to create jobs. And that academic article that he wrote was also being mirrored at that time in cinema. And Raj, for those of you who are familiar with Raj Kapoor's movies, the sort of vagabond tramp character reflected a person who was frustrated by life because of lack of opportunities for job. So I have basically a couple of slides just to tell you what my framework is. And in a way, I would almost prefer you don't look over there, because you want to post. I felt I should write something so that if people read it later, they have something to read. But there's a principal theme I have is that economic progress depends on the provision of public goods. And public goods, I mean specifically education, urban areas, water, clean air. These are essential. These are essential not just for economic progress, they are essential for social justice. If you don't have these public goods, you don't have social justice. But in a democratic process, and this is true of all democracies, not just for India, in a democratic process, politicians are naturally inclined to a short-term view. They are naturally inclined to give people job quotas, subsidies, and at the very extreme things like televisions and laptops and so on to buy votes. That's much easier than promising public goods which have a very diffuse character. If you say that you will have clean water, that is a much harder way of getting votes than of giving somebody 5,000 rupees. What happens as a consequence, as a result, is that democracies create special interest groups, pressure groups, which enhance that shortism. Again, in Raj's terminology, that is what he called intermediate regimes. That you have many competing interests who demand priority, and that demanding of priority creates exceptions and special privileges at the cost of public goods. And if you don't have public goods, you have frustration, political anger, and eventually violence. Why am I not getting this down? Okay, and so this is the last part of my framework, and then after this I jump into the history. What was the challenge at independence? The challenge was the Red Queen, what I call the Red Queen challenge, which is to run. So the Red Queen said, if you run at twice the speed you can, you stay in the same place. To get someplace else, you have to run faster than twice as fast. For India, there were two challenges to run. One is to run the global competitive race, and the other was demography is destiny. We knew in 1950 that we would have a population of about a billion. We needed to create jobs along the way to keep pace with that rise. So we needed to create a competitive economy that provided good jobs. And in principle, there is a virtuous circle. In principle, there is a virtuous circle. In that virtuous circle, if there is economic progress, then there is greater political willingness to share and to create collective public goods. That process feeds back in particular through a very important mechanism in the development process, which is greater involvement of women in the civic process. And that creates even more equitable economic progress. And this process feeds on itself and can lead to both greater political evolution as well as economic progress. The opposite can happen too. And the opposite happens when political disorder goes ahead. And when political disorder goes ahead, you can have a vicious cycle. You have fewer public goods, you have unequal economic progress, you have marginalization of women, and more political disorder. And the basic test for India was, which of these cycles do we get into? To the virtuous cycle, which leads to collective political progress and economic progress, or the other way around. The great danger for India always was that if you do not have progress, there will be what I call the authoritarian temptation. The temptation will be, well, this democracy thing doesn't really work. We really should have a more authoritarian regime. And that's the basic historical framework within which Mrs. Gandhi comes in. Mrs. Gandhi comes in at a very critical juncture, and she is seduced by the notion of authoritarianism. And in so doing, she lays the roots of what I call political violence. So Mrs. Gandhi, to be fair to her, inherited a nation in turmoil. There was an extremely severe drought in 1965. India was hopelessly dependent on food aid. The balance of payments was basically running dry. And there was political turmoil in the country. There were shortages, there was high inflation. There was the fragmenting of something that people at the time called the Congress system. The Congress system was the old Congress within which an umbrella of interests were contained within the Congress and resolved their differences through intra-party compromises. That system of compromises within the Congress party was breaking down. At the same time, states were asserting their rights. One particular example, and there were many, there were language riots in Tamil Nadu, there were rice riots in Kerala, but one example that is particularly germane to this discussion is that the Shiv Sena was formed just about the time that Mrs. Gandhi came in. And the Shiv Sena's formation is noteworthy not only because of its regional aspect, but why? It was sort of the first time the notion of sons of soil and the idea that you keep out people was becoming legitimized. And so the angry young Maharashtrian comes to the fore for the first time in the Shiv Sena formation. And the key aspect of all these protests that were occurring throughout India was that they were almost always channeled through student riots. Students are a very convenient mechanism for funneling protests, because you can't dismiss them. And so, unlike labor unions where you can put pressure, you really can't put very much pressure on students. And students had their own frustrations. The Raj phenomenon of educated unemployed was still a problem. Poor degrees, poor job prospects. So if there was a problem, they were ready to participate and amplify those problems. So we have, one of the first things Mrs. Gandhi did was to devalue. Another IMF loan, a second drought in '66. The devaluation, as you may remember, was controversial, but the problem was that devaluation, even though necessary and a good policy, even though it was criticized by some at the time, it was an essential policy. But devaluation is a crutch. Devaluation is like taking an aspirin. It doesn't cure the headache. You need to invest. The reason you devalue is because you do not have a competitive economy, and you need to create a competitive economy, for which you need to invest in your future. And East Asia was showing the way ahead. So Mrs. Gandhi understood this. She makes the statement in December of '96, I feel that education needs to be much changed, a thorough overhaul. But just like her father did not, neither did Mrs. Gandhi invest in education. The key things that happens through Mrs. Gandhi's tenure from 1966 to 1984 is that the East Asians, led by the Koreans, invest in education as the primary goal. And this is again where the Red Queen effect begins to operate. That labor-intensive manufacturing required increasingly demanding standards of production. So people say, well, it's labor-intensive, you manufacture garments, anybody can manufacture garments. That's not true. What the East Asians were showing is that as you move up even in garment production or simple electronic assembly, you need to maintain extremely high standards of quality, for which you need extremely high standards of industrial literacy. Labor intensive does not mean lack of quality and industrial literacy. And the East Asians basically formed their industrial strategy on a bedrock of education. At the same time, and this is the right part of this panel, they began to bring women into the workforce. This is another crucial aspect of the East Asian experience, is that labor-intensive manufacturing was being was being personed by, was being manned by, if you will, by women. So you have educated women coming into the workforce, producing goods for international consumption, at the same time creating a higher status for women in society, which in turn meant that women will take better care of their kids, send their kids to school, and so you create this virtuous cycle. Mrs. Gandhi instead, and this is why Mrs. Gandhi becomes such an important historical figure, is that instead of investing in the future, she decided to create a cult. And so in December 1966, just before the February 1967 election, she makes the statement, my position amongst the people is uncontested. Mrs. Gandhi, even at that early stage, was beginning to distinguish herself from the Congress party. There's the Congress party and there's me, Mrs. Gandhi. The Congress won, and the downhill process starts. In November 1968, she gave Sanjay Gandhi was shortlisted for production of car. In 69, she nationalized the banks. She claimed that this was for a vital step for millions of small farmers, artisans, and self-employed persons, but it quickly became a form of patronage politics. Nationalized banks are an extraordinary well of corruption, because you can give money to people for long periods of time without any clear accountability and transparency. And the bills come home only after a long time, when the non-performing loans begin to gather and the recapitalization of the banks have to be done, as has been done periodically every decade or every whatever number of years. Sanjay gets the license to Maruti, and she makes a statement, "My son has shown great enterprise, I could not say no to him." And within several months of getting that, Sanjay started pressuring the nationalized banks for loans. And so, in the period from 1967 to 1974, Mrs. Gandhi began a process of a personal cult and a personal corruption. This is all before emergency. So it's very important to understand that the emergency which everybody knows about comes much after the basic political decay had begun. And as the cult grew, so did political violence. Again, in the 1971 election, the message was vote for Indira, not for Congress. So there's a little story, one voter saying, "No one else cares about us. She has nationalized the banks, which means she cares for us." There's a mirror of this story in the demonetization story, that the demonetization goes against the rich, therefore he cares for us. This notion of taking an action that is apparently caring for us is valuable in political terms. That election then also sets the standards for much higher campaign spending. It's also the first election when thugs and gundas become part of the electoral process. Mrs. Gandhi wins big, and there's a celebration. This is the cover of the London Economist, which anoints her Empress of India. The Economist says, "She has made India in her own image." While Mrs. Gandhi is making India in her own image, the basic problems of competitiveness and jobs have not been solved. This is the start of the angry young man phenomenon. By now, the population is 560 million people. We are about 20 years, about 25 years after independence. The IMF, of all institutions, in its annual report in February of 1971, says jobs is the most pressing issue for India. The IMF also points out something that Raj had pointed out in 59. We don't really know how large this problem is, but we know it's very large. Because in India, you cannot measure unemployment in a conventional way. So, while we did not have the numbers, we saw the mirror of the angry young unemployed in the cinema. So just like you had Shri 420 and Awara in the 50s, where you had the same phenomenon but in a more idealistic form, now you had the vigilantes, the people who took matters into their own hand. Begins with Satyajit Ray's Pratidwandi, Mere Apne, and the real culmination of this is Salim Khan and Javed Akhtar. And they were young people, and as Javed Akhtar said, it was time to take the law in one's own hand. And that is the character that Amitabh Bachchan then plays in Zanjeer and Diwar, where the combination of vigilante and somebody who is disillusioned because he's unemployed come together. In real life, that came together in the Navnirman riots in Gujarat in 1974. The Navnirman riots of Gujarat in 1974 are crucial because you see all the pathologies there. You see the intense corruption for campaign financing. You see the cynical use of money for personal purposes. And you see it being funneled through students, through the angry young man. But the economists still believed in Mrs. Gandhi. And so when the Allahabad judgment came, it has this title, O Allahabad. And the economist essentially says, look, the Allahabad judgment, it was a minor transgression. Don't worry about it. But it then makes a much more important phrase, which is what I call the populist temptation. It says, a muddling democracy is not easy to justify in a subcontinent of paupers. This is the view that the international press takes. This is unfortunately the view that a lot of us also take. And there are always these sort of subcurrents within the country of people saying, well, this democracy thing is not really working. We really need to have something more. The authoritarian temptation continues. So this is a little bit over the top, but it's a little bit of a coincidence that Sholay, the movie Sholay and Emergency come almost on the same date. For those of you who remember Sholay, it was one of the most gruesomely violent films that had been made up until that time. In fact, the critics called it unimaginably violent, borders on the sickening. And the Emergency, which had not, the policy process which had not been able to solve the crucial problem of public goods, the Emergency tried to do it by brute force. So-called, the jobs issue was to be tackled by sterilization, by forcible sterilization, by reducing the number of people. Instead of giving jobs to people, just reduce the number of people. And also this phrase, as far as I can judge, emerges for the first time, urban beautification. Urban beautification is a euphemism for getting the poor out of urban areas instead of doing a proper urban development. This phrase, urban beautification, has continued in our lexicon ever since. And then, of course, while Sanjay was doing the forced sterilization and the urban beautification, Mother suppressed the opposition. So, what was Mrs. Gandhi's economic legacy? There was some decline in poverty. So if you look at this red line, or there are two different poverty measures depending on the World Bank line or the Indian Suresh Tendulkar line. There was some decline in poverty. One of my classmates, M.H. Suryanarayan, says that this decline is illusory. He says that the poverty was over-measured in the 60s and under-measured in the 80s. For various reasons, due to cost of living adjustments. Therefore, in his view, there was no decline in poverty. Even if you take a more gracious view, it was a modest decline. India was still grimly poor when Mrs. Gandhi led, despite her promise of Garibi Hatao. Just as a benchmark, I've put the Korean poverty rate. And I've also compared the Indian urbanization rate to the Korean rate. So Korea was not very far from India in the early 60s. The gap was modest, but over this 20-year period, that gap essentially ballooned. But her crucial legacy was political violence. The election she won in 1980 was marked by even more violence than before. There was violence in Madurai, Hyderabad, Raebareli, Dhanbad. very crucially, this is the first election that we know of that those with pending criminal cases are elected to the Lok Sabha. These are people who later would be called history sheeters or charge sheeters. They had charge sheets against them, but they were not convicted. But because the judicial process works slowly, lots of people have charge sheets for years and years. They are not convicted, but they then become members of parliament. It was a period again of grave economic crisis in her final term. But then she left a signature statement legitimizing her own legacy, in which she said, corruption is a global phenomenon. So what I did was all right. And again, the mirror of reality is in politics. You see a movie in 1983, Ardha Satya. Ardha Satya is a very important film of the time. It's the first film that shows, as best as I could judge, the nexus between the police, the politician, and the criminal. So this, in a sense, was, if you will, you start with Mrs. Gandhi at a certain point, at a critical juncture, when things are bad. And there's the possibility then of dealing with it in hopefully a constructive and more positive way, which is more forward-looking, which invests in the future. And there is the possibility that we have seen, which emerges an endemic violence, corruption, and crime. At that point, there's a change and there's a promise. So my original title was Promise to Hubris. So you enter a phase of 20 years of promise and aspiration. But this promise and aspiration had an underbelly of dark political decay. So this story is taken from a New Yorker article by Amitabh Ghosh. I don't know, Kanan is maybe the only person, or Jose may remember, that Amitabh Ghosh was visiting us at the time. And Amitabh Ghosh, many years later, wrote his personal recollection of the Sikh riots after Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated. And the phrase that I have highlighted here, menacing bands of mostly red-eyed young men in half-buttoned shirts on a cool, crisp morning. So it was a cool, crisp morning, but they had half-unbuttoned shirts. And they are the guys who then overnight lit up the Sikh houses and businesses. It's an important event because this is the moment at which the young, angry young man becomes political fodder in the cause of potentially Hindu nationalism. So Rajiv Gandhi comes in. The Wall Street Journal calls him Rajiv Reagan, which is, in its eyes, is the highest accolade. He had tax and tariff reforms. But while the world was applauding him, just like The Economist had applauded Mrs. Gandhi, Rajiv was vowing Muslim and Hindu votes. So he shepherded an act of parliament under which Muslim men could refuse alimony to their wives. And then he did two things in February 1986 and November 1989, which made the demolition of the Babri Masjid possible. There were two events there where, in principle, Rajiv Gandhi could have stopped the process of the opening of the Babri Masjid and the laying of the foundation stone next to the masjid. In the meantime, his government lived beyond its means, left behind an imminent crisis. You have Manmohan Singh. And Manmohan Singh then heralds the aspirational India. He has this phrase, let the whole world hear it loud and clear. India is now awake. That was the rise of aspirational India. There's a devaluation, IMF loan, there's a deregulation process. So I asked myself, what is this aspirational India? there are lots of people who talk about aspirational India. And I found if you probe into this word, which is a very uplifting word, there are two things. One is India tapping into the technology world. So there is the launch of Cafe Coffee Day in 1996. And it's launched in Bangalore, which is called the Silicon Valley of India. And you get a cup of coffee and internet for 100 rupees an hour. And it's a cool place to chill out. That was one of the symbols of aspirational India. On March 11, 1999, at 10 a.m., I figured out the time. Infosys became the first Indian registered company to list on NASDAQ, became a big deal. March 2000, Bill Clinton comes to India. He stops in Hyderabad, which is called Cyberabad, where he congratulates Chandrababu Naidu for being tech savvy. He talks about 25-year-old Indian multimillionaires. He talks about India's dazzling diaspora in Silicon Valley. This becomes the symbol of aspirational India. There's another cuter version of aspirational India. So this is a frequency of words used in books digitized by Google. So you see that the word yoga suddenly went up a crest in its use, as did the word fitness. So the Western world was going through a period of a new period of fitness craze, and yoga blended in beautifully with that. Yoga rode that crest, and that became a symbol of Indian soft power. The best I can judge is that this tech and yoga became symbols of Indian aspiration. What was happening in the economy? In this period of aspirational India, the sectors that grew fastest were finance and real estate and construction. So aspirational India produced, in effect, a finance construction boom. Whereas manufacturing, the share of manufacturing actually declined. It was worse in jobs, because there are no jobs in finance. So as agricultural jobs came down, what were the sectors in which jobs were going up? Not in manufacturing. In fact, the share of jobs in manufacturing has steadily gone down. Construction jobs. Construction jobs are essentially casual labor, very harsh conditions. People were pulling out of low productivity agriculture to move into construction jobs. In some ways, it was moving into a somewhat higher income status, but it was still extremely grim living. So I asked myself the question, did this happen all over India? And the answer is yes. So I compare Tamil Nadu and Bihar. It's the same story. Manufacturing share goes down, construction goes up. There is a broad-based construction boom throughout the country. It's in the public sector, it's in the private sector, it's in commercial real estate. India grew into one of the world's most unequal societies during this period. So Brazil is right at the top. Brazil and South Africa, essentially India is now in that same league, whether you look at the top 1% or the top 10%. Inequality is not just a problem because there are grotesque differences in income. Inequality is also a problem because it further undermines the provision of public goods. The very rich, they produce their own public goods. They create their own security, education, water. In Sao Paulo and Mexico City, there are commuter services on helicopter. In Bombay today, only Mukesh Ambani seems to be using it. But believe me, it's a matter of time when helicopter services will become more common even in Mumbai. Because the rich can send their kids to Stanford and Cornell, they have no interest in education, in promoting education in the country. There is no societal consensus to use the tax revenues for creating better schools and better universities. So this is a picture you're all familiar with. What's on the left hand? The left side. Sorry? Who's on the left side? And what is she wearing? So this is her wedding sari. So how much did her wedding sari cost? This is 2007. No one, I thought that was a popularly known number, it's 75 lakhs. So at the, some good things came out of the aspirational period. Infant mortality rates came down, poverty rates came down. But even on those, India did not do as well as some of the other countries did. So one of the things that from here on I will follow is Bangladesh and Vietnam. So you see that Bangladesh's infant mortality comes down faster than Indian infant mortality. Bangladesh's poverty rates comes down faster than Indian poverty. So India benefited not just, so there's a lazy explanation that there was an economic boom which led to reduction in poverty. I call it lazy not because it's not partially true. I call it lazy because it does not fully understand that there was a global decline which was happening everywhere, even where the growth rates were not as spectacular. But there was also this phenomenon that Angus Deaton calls Great Escape, which is that medical technology had improved worldwide, its effects were being spread, so-called vector-borne disease control was becoming easier. There was a general decline in infant mortality rates. In India, the decline in poverty, on the other hand, to the extent it occurred, and it did occur, put people from poverty into very precarious state, which is they put them into construction work and such like jobs which themselves had their own problems. So if you were to assess poverty in a broader sense, the poverty reduction and achievement was much weaker than you would find just in the raw numbers. So again I asked myself the question, did at least the best in India do better? Because an India poverty rate might be a misleading number. Sorry, so first just to say, yes, poverty rates did go down everywhere, including in Bihar. And then, because it's hard to compare poverty rates across countries and Indian states, what I have here is the health component of the Human Development Index. So the state of Tamil Nadu, so Vietnam has a per capita income approximately 2/3 that of of Tamil Nadu. So Vietnam is a poorer country than Tamil Nadu is as a state in terms of per capita income. Despite being poorer, Vietnam has had much better health delivery. Bangladesh has a per capita income of about half of Tamil Nadu, and it is now almost at the same level in Human Development Index, in the health component as Tamil Nadu is. So yes, just to emphasize, I do not want to say that we did not have an achievement in the aspirational period, but I do want to emphasize that that achievement was, I don't even want to say it was modest. I want to say that it was not the best we could have achieved if we had followed a different economic strategy. There are other dark sides of aspirational India which I want to quickly point out. Already in 1991, the rivers were sewers, the Ganga and Jamuna were biologically dead and chemically lethal, The water supply was polluted. And I was somewhat struck, I did not realize this till I read this. But even in 1991, Indian cities ranked amongst the world's worst in terms of air quality. The other dark side of this aspirational period begins with the demolition of Babri Masjid. The Babri Masjid, again, the actual action at Babri Masjid was unemployed young men who were again used as fodder for the process of the demolition. And as this says, a wedge of young men waving clubs charged, and the police vanished. It was followed by bloody riots in Bombay and throughout India. The criminal politician link spread during this period. The NN Vohra Committee in July of 1993 finally officially recognized the growing presence of gang leaders in elected bodies. In the 1998 elections, the history sheeters and charge sheeters who had begun their appearance in 1980 now were a much larger phenomenon. And then there was this murder of Jessica Lal. So some of you may remember, she was a model serving at a bar in a Delhi nightclub, and a guy walks up to her and asks her for a drink, and she says, "It's too late, I need to close the bar." And he says, "I'll pay you 1,000 rupees," and she says, "Not even for 1,000 rupees." And he turns to her and says, "For 1,000 rupees I could have you." At which point he pulls out a gun, shoots in the air, takes aim at her and shoots her dead in front of a whole nightclub. There are eyewitnesses. He himself confesses. He says, she hurt me in some way. Fast forward, all the witnesses withdrew their testimony. The young man who did the shooting, Manu Sharma, was connected to a very influential Congress politician. The politician-criminal nexus worked over time, and Times of India then had this very ironical headline on the day the court said, "Set Manu Sharma free." Jessica Lal was killed, but no one killed Jessica Lal. That story then, eventually Manu Sharma did go to jail because of investigative journalism. But that story for me encapsulates so much that was wrong in the aspirational period. The criminal politician nexus, the downgrading of women in this very cynical and despicable way. So I asked myself, do we murder women more than others? And actually the answer is quite interesting. So these are UN statistics. In violent societies, there is a lot of violence, but people kill men predominantly. India is the only country that I could figure out where men and women get equally killed as often. There are many sociological reasons for that, but there's a more serious statistic over here which I feel is extremely important: the decline in the sex ratio. So the sex ratio declined from 1901. It has stabilized. It is still very low by international standards. In a normal population, there should be about 1,080 women for every 1,000 men. We have 940 women. But look at the sex ratio at birth. The sex ratio at birth has continued to go down. The sex ratio at birth, which in 2011 was about 915, should in a normal population be about 950. So there's a clear process by which the role of women in society is much more severely degraded than other countries. So aspirational India's darkest moment then comes in Gujarat. But again, there is an Ayodhya connection. The riots in Gujarat have their origin in Ayodhya. So these so-called Kar Sevaks, these young men, had gone to Ayodhya with the idea of building a temple. They had some notion that they would be given permission to start building the temple. They were coming back on the train, which then caught fire, which led to the very grievous riots. But this is the bookend to the aspirational India. It starts in 1984, in November 1984 with the Sikh riots. It continues with the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992. It continues into 2002 with the Gujarat riots. And my claim is that from this aspirational India, the angry young man becomes the midwife of the emergence of Hindu nationalism. This is the process by which the energy of the angry young man was channeled into Hindu nationalism to become a political force. So you have this not so shining India. The BJP lost in the 2004 election. By now, the reasons for the loss were many, but for me, again, the most sort of symbolically important loss was Chandrababu Naidu's loss, where he was being heralded as sort of the symbol of aspirational India for the tech savviness. You had the combination at the same time of the farmer suicides. The inequalities were now being manifest. There's a very interesting footnote to this period, that after the loss, there was a view among some in the BJP that Narendra Mody had become a liability to the BJP. And Vajpayee held a meeting of the BJP parliamentary board in Manali, in which he proposed getting rid of Narendra Mody as Gujarat chief minister. And he was roundly rejected by the rest of the parliamentary board, which included L.K. Advani and Arun Jaitley. So although the BJP lost that 2004 election, the potential Hindu nationalistic force that had been generated in the aspirational period continued as a force into the next period. The next period, and I'll run through this somewhat quicker, the finance construction model that evolved in the aspirational period was unsustainable, and the window of India's promise that had opened up in 1984 was beginning to close. So again, the Congress started well. The Employment Guarantee Scheme, the Right to Information Act, but then fell into a corruption morass. But that was not obvious immediately. There was a little bit of a glow that was left over, and that glow came from a very fortunate global circumstance. So what was happening in this period, 2003 to 2008, is that China was emerging as a global force after its accession to the WTO. The emergence of China marks an extraordinarily important new phase for the world as well as for India. In the first instance, what happened was that when China came in, it boosted world trade because China began to trade enormously. It revved up world trade, world GDP went up, India rode that crest. This period between 2003 and 2008, which India rode, which gave, in a sense, a further reinforcement of the idea that India was shining, was really a global bubble being driven by China and the US subprime process. After 2008, growth was still kept alive by fiscal boost. The slowdown had begun, and then, according to me, the slowdown has continued even sharper than these numbers show, but the official numbers show 2015 growth rates picked up. That, as we know, is a statistical fudge. The problem, India had lost competitiveness. And so I'll show you some pictures on Indian competitiveness. India's share of world exports, merchandise exports, essentially flattened out around 2009. That's the black line. China, by the way, is on the right-hand scale, because if I put China on the same scale, everybody would look so diminutive that you would not see any other country. In services export, India does well, then dips. It has picked up recently. I don't know whether this continues, but it's still close to its peak over the last 4 years. So I looked into what India exports. And these are India's top 12 exports. India's top 12 exports, there's still a very heavy natural resource base. Cotton yarn is our most important export in terms of world market penetration because we have good cotton. We export diamonds and diamond products. We export organic dyes because we have access to various kinds of petrochemicals. Cyclic hydrocarbons, aluminium, petroleum oils. In terms of manufactured goods, the only one that really intrigued me was this turbojets and turbines. Do you know what turbojets and turbines is? This is Hindustan Aeronautics. This is the old public sector, the Valuris of the world who beavered away in these national public laboratories and public sector organizations, created world-class products as niche products. And then we have auto and auto parts, and you will see a little bit more of our performance in that and also in pharmaceuticals. Where we lost out during this entire period was in labor-intensive manufacturing because we never invested in education. So on the top panel you have electrical and electronic products. China dominates. Vietnam is now coming up. Looking into the imports on the right-hand panel, into the imports into India, you see how large the share of Chinese imports is of electrical goods into India. China is going down, Hong Kong is going up. Toys, we don't export toys. China dominates, and again Vietnam is picking up. Again in toys, we get most of our toys now from China. Clothing, we lost the clothing rates 3 times. First we lost it to Korea, then when Korea moved away from garments, we lost it to China. And today there is this view which is for some peculiar reason widely held in the country that China is now scaling back for various reasons. This is India's opportunity. I'm sorry to bring the bad news, but we have missed that window already. Vietnam and Bangladesh have already taken that window. The same thing is about to happen in textiles. Korea is going down, China is stabilizing, Vietnam is picking up. It will be a matter of few years at this current pace where Vietnam exceeds India also in textiles. So electronics and garments and textiles, which is where the jobs are created, which is where these countries created jobs. We completely missed out on that. We did well in computer services. But look what's happened since 2011. The great dazzle of the NASDAQ listing of Infosys and the Wipros, all very important, all very creditable. But that share is coming down, guess to who? To China. Why China? Because Chinese students today are much better educated than Indian students are. Not just in school, but in universities. Those of you who follow this will know that in science, technology, and particularly in mathematics and computing, Chinese universities are not just good, They're amongst the best in the world. They're literally amongst the best in the world. And so the export of software comes from China is no surprise. Pharmaceuticals, India did well, but for a variety of quality reasons, variety of fraudulent practices going down, again China is picking up. There are two sectors in which the Indian export share is still going up, more or less. Auto-related auto and auto parts. In autos, it's sort of flattened out at 0.9%. Auto parts, it's 1.2%. But again, look, in autos, China is already going ahead of us. Auto parts, China is way ahead of us. And the other problem with autos is we are coming very late to the game. This is an industry that is already becoming obsolete in the next 10 years. The auto industry as we know it will not exist. The structure of auto production will completely make obsolete the current set of production techniques and skills. The final area we are doing well is in organic chemicals. And the reason we are doing well in organic chemicals is that these are extremely polluting industries, which the Western world is getting rid of. And so is shifting to the less developed world. China has taken up a lot of that. India has taken up a lot of that. Recently, India got a big boost. The stock prices of a lot of organic chemical companies went up because Chinese said they're going to stop, they're going to restrict organic chemical production because of their extremely polluting effects. So yes, we are producing organic chemicals. Often you will hear people say, oh, we are moving into a somewhat more high-tech, and they'll give you the example of organic chemicals. But organic chemicals may be higher technology than garments, but in terms of social welfare costs, it's not clear to me that it produces jobs. It certainly hurts the environment. So there are two stories over here which are related. There's this fellow Rana Dasgupta. I don't know if you've read this book called Capital. It's a brilliant book on Delhi. And he has two young entrepreneurs talk to him. And there's a grotesquely lavish home. The young fellow has a massage parlor and a chill-out room in his house. And he has a restaurant in his own house to cater to his buddies. And he says to Rana Dasgupta, he says, the wealth you see in front of you comes from my real estate business. I don't make any money on my auto business. Another guy says, with the rise of China, we stop producing. We just sell stuff other people produce, German, American, Chinese. And then he says, my grandfather still runs a stethoscope factory, even though it makes losses because it's an emotional crutch to him. So the fact that we lost competitiveness has its implications in the labor market. So here, Kannan has a recent paper, several papers, but a recent paper that unpublished he shared with me. You see the decline in the labor force participation of women. Again, people will give all kinds of explanations. Well, say, families are becoming richer, so women are going back home. As Kannan's research shows, it's complete nonsense. These are poor women who have no job alternatives. And so they're just withdrawing from the labor force. Bangladesh, in the meantime, which was also low, has picked up. So a very large fraction of our labor force, potential labor force, is just simply coming out of the labor force. Raj had also pointed out to the problem of high unemployment rates amongst the educated. So here I need to make one caveat. I show that the rates of unemployment for the illiterate are very low. As Kannan points out in his paper, the illiterate just withdraw from the labor force in very large numbers. But the problem of educated unemployed remains. Even in Tamil Nadu, having a graduate degree is almost a curse, because you then have a degree but you have no no employment. And the problem of youth unemployment remains a social tinderbox. So you have youth unemployment rates of 15-20%. Youth unemployment rates are high in many parts of the world, but youth unemployment rates in a situation that is socially explosive, given the history of the angry young man, this remains a problem that is going to create the tendencies towards violence. In the meantime, school enrollment rates have gone up, but school quality remains abysmal. So one of the startling features of our educational system is that as children go up the grade level, they fall back in performance. This happens because kids are promoted even though they do not have the performance to get promoted. Once promoted, nobody takes care of them. Once promoted, nobody takes care of them, they get poor marks. So as you go up the school, you become less prepared to go into the university education and job market. And even Tamil Nadu, again, this is a very peculiar number that you will see in another survey. Bihar actually does better than Tamil Nadu in educational metrics. Another metric, have things improved over time? Not clear. It doesn't seem that there's been any improvement over time. A 5th grade child, almost more than half the 5th grade children in Tamil Nadu and Bihar cannot read at the 2nd grade level. Only about a quarter to 1/3 of the kids in 5th grade can do division. In contrast, Vietnam provides a world-class school education. By world-class, I mean world-class. Vietnamese science scores in PISA are higher than that of Korea's. Vietnamese math scores are higher than that of France. And Vietnam, even more so than Korea and France, provides a highly equitable education. In other words, the fraction of low performers is very small. So, you see Vietnam producing electronics, garments, textiles. It's not a coincidence. It is because there has been a massive investment in education, which is bringing it up to a level of industrial literacy that meets world standards. The environment story, you know, the only thing I was struck by is that if I took the May 1991 New York Times report and put it over here, it would all still be the same. Rivers are still sewers. The Ganga and Jamuna, despite the Prime Minister's promise, are large tracts are biologically dead and chemically lethal. The water is more severely polluted. Indian cities still rank amongst the worst in the world. And to make matters worse, we have closed up lots of water bodies. Urban trash in Delhi and Mumbai continues to be unmanageable. And even Niti Aayog, which is otherwise a cheerleader for the Prime Minister, says next year some cities could actually run out of water. There isn't a crisis waiting to happen. We are in a crisis. India is both over-urbanized and under-urbanized. So again, the urbanization rates for Bangladesh and Vietnam are going ahead of us. Then people will tell you, well, if you look from the satellite, India is actually much more urbanized. These official numbers are not right. That is true. But what is that urbanization? That is a chaos. There are people who come in, who create, work in various colonies, they get demolished, they get moved. That's not urbanization, that is a place for work and commuting. That is a place where you put people in precarious conditions because there's nowhere else for them to go. That is not the basis for modern economic growth. So, I'm almost at the end. What has this government done? People will say, well, this government is changing things. So I concede, look, there are lots of controversies, how much Swachh Bharat has achieved. It's moved in the right direction. The gas cylinders is a good idea. There's greater social security for a lot of people in the country. There are green economic shoots in some industries. The government reports that the doing of business index has improved. I don't see the doing of business improvement in the export shares as of yet. I don't expect to see them there because that depends on a fundamental bedrock of education in my view. But what is most important is that the basic politics has remained completely unchanged. The politics that Raj described in the intermediate regime paper, the politics of short-termism and patronage, now continues in GST. GST has got multiple bans, multiple exceptions. It's become a lobbying ground of pressure groups. A GST is supposed to have 2 bands, no arguments. Now, because it's opened up, everybody wants their own exception. Sorry, I have a problem. Can I get this discussion, this concession? Same thing is happening in tariff rates. The lobbying for increased tariff rates has steadily increased. India is, even Arvind Pangadia, who's another cheerleader for the Mody government, is extremely critical of the raising of tariff rates. And finally, the benchmark for me, whether a government is in fact serious about policy change, is what it does with the nationalized banks. This government has never come even close to dreaming of privatizing the national banks. Why? Because the nationalized banks remain in a source of disguised patronage. The beauty about public sector banks is that you don't know what they're doing until the NPAs come up. And therefore, there is no easy way of tracking how the patronage is being distributed. And that is why no government wants to get rid of them, as long as the government is involved in the business of patronage. So on this right-hand side, you have a chart of something called the market to book value ratio. If the market to book value ratio is below 1, the markets are saying, all these assets you claim are on your book, they are not worth the amount that you think they are. The market to book value ratios for many nationalized banks are now running below 0.5, which means the markets are saying half your stuff is garbage. And the political decay has continued. Here I've just given you some numbers on campaign expenses in India. The black bar shows the rapidity with which campaign expenses, which began to grow under Mrs. Gandhi, have ballooned. As a point of comparison, I've given you the United States numbers. So US campaign expenses were much larger than in India in the early 2000s. Today, India campaign expenditures are much larger. When somebody tells me that this government is rooting out black money, I say, look here, this is the black money. Every penny of this money is black money. By definition, the share of criminals has steadily gone up. In every Lok Sabha election, the red bar is for serious crimes. The red bar, serious crimes means rapes, murders, kidnapping, extortion. 25% of Lok Sabha members have pending charges for serious crimes. I know, it sounds funny, but I wish I could cry. So, I conclude by saying that today's broken model has become a prisoner of its past. Mrs. Gandhi began a cult politics which bred corruption. it has changed form over the years. The nature of corruption, the nature of the cult, selling the cult, has changed. Vote for Indra has changed into brand Mody, into the films made as heliographies of the Prime Minister. But the basic resilience of that cult model has remained. The growth slowdown that began in 2008, it seems to me, marks not a cyclical slowdown, but a fundamental breakdown of the finance construction model of the aspirational period. We never developed a manufacturing sector. Therefore, we have very few sources of growth. The angry young man remains now in a coiled form in the garb of Hindu nationalism, ready to burst as long as whenever there is a need. And so I began this talk by saying, is India prepared for its future? And what I end by saying is, the growth model is breaking down at the same time as we have a critical shortage of public goods. So the lack of public goods is more acute than ever at the time the growth model is breaking down. Can this change? Maybe. But it is also possible that we get into a trap of low growth and political disorder that continues for a long time. There will therefore always be a temptation for authoritarianism. And people will say, well, all that is good, we understand that, therefore we need authoritarianism. And so I just take the example of Tamil Nadu, which had a sort of form of democratic authoritarianism for a number of years. And you see two examples. The sex ratio at birth in Tamil Nadu, despite its vaunted medical system, is declining. There's a little book by a journalist, Krupa Gay, called Rivers Don't Lie, which talk about the 2015 Chennai floods. It's a classic story of the breakdown of public goods. There were Chennai floods. Everybody knew that there would be a flood. Nobody did anything about it because nobody wants to invest in the future. Floods came, the most vulnerable got hit the worst. In the cleanup, the most vulnerable got hit the worst. There are people who came in to clean the sewage without gloves and without boots. They suffered through the ravages of the acid of that collected garbage. In the name of urban beautification, the poor were moved out of Chennai. Many of them were fish vendors who have to be at work at 3 o'clock in the morning. And they were moved so far that they had to leave their homes at midnight to commute. And the system did not do anything to correct. The justice system did not punish anybody. The political system brought back Jayalalitha. In the next election, the AIDMK politicians gave 5,000 rupees to lots of voters and bought votes. The system is dismally unjust in a framework where you don't have public goods. And that framework then perpetuates the lack of public goods. So, you will be right to ask me what is my vision of the future. Look, what I'm going to offer to you as my vision is also an idealism. And I know I've given you a very realist view of Indian history, and idealism will always be trumped by realism. But if I had a vision, it would be through decentralization. It would be through greater empowerment of local communities. And in that vision, in that more idealistic vision, some might say naively idealistic vision, the local communities will develop local public goods. because they will have greater incentive within the local community to develop public goods. Watching some communities do better, others will be forced to copy, and through that a diffusion process will occur. In my view, from our instinct today to centralize everything, we need to move in the opposite direction. I recognize that decentralization itself has risks, but I fear that staying the course has much more grave dangers. So on that cheery note, I'm going to stop and leave a little bit, a few minutes. At least I hope that you will ask some questions so we can have a little bit of an exchange. Do we have a few minutes?